Hi again. I want to talk to you today about Elisha's double portion. Elisha's ministry began when Elijah's ministry ended, and Elisha was an understudy to Elijah. We can read about this in 1 Kings chapter 19. Verse 15 it says, "The Lord said to him, Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel. And anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah to succeed you as prophet." So this is Elijah. The Lord was saying to Elijah, to go back the way he came. Now, he had just gone to the mountain. He had heard the still small voice of God. And now the Lord was telling him, go back the way he came. And among other things, to anoint Elisha to succeed him as prophet. Remember, before he went to the mountain to talk to God, Elijah had told God that he'd had enough, that he was no better than his ancestors, and basically he'd had enough. And so God honored that, and he actually right away, right after that, named Elisha as his successor. So after Elisha had been Elijah's understudy for a little bit, Elijah was going to get called up to heaven. This was common knowledge among all the prophets of God. They all seem to know about it, and we'll read about it here in 2 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 1. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied, "but do not speak of it." So here we can see that the prophets all knew that Elijah was going to be taken from them on this particular day. So God had spoken to all the prophets about this. And if we keep reading in verse 4, it says, Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," he replied, "but do not speak of it." So here's some prophets in an entirely different city, and they had also heard from God that Elijah was going to be taken up. We continue reading at verse 6. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. 50 men of the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Verse 9. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. Verse 10. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, not." As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them apart. So here we see that Elisha did see Elijah when he was taken up to heaven. So his request was granted. He said, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." And Elijah said, "If you see me when I am taken from you, then you will get it." Well, Elisha saw Elijah get taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. So let's see this double portion of Elisha at work. We continue reading at verse 13. He picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. The company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. Later on in chapter 3, we read in 2 Kings, verse 9, "So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom, and after a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for their animals with them." "What?" exclaimed the king of Israel. "Has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to hand us over to Moab?" Now, as a little background here, these 3 kings were going to attack Moab because Moab was threatening Israel. Verse 11, "But Jehoshaphat asked, 'Is there no prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord through him?' An officer of the king of Israel answered, 'Elisha, son of Shaphat, is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah.' Jehoshaphat said, 'The word of the Lord is with him.' So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. Now Jehoshaphat was a good king. He was the king of Judah. Remember, Israel and Judah were 2 separate kingdoms at this time. And since the times of Jeroboam and Rehoboam, they've been 2 separate kingdoms. And Jehoshaphat was the good king. He was actually a God-fearing king in Judah, and he reigned from Jerusalem. And remember, the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. So the descendants of Esau are the Edomites here, that we're going to fight with Israel and Judah against Moab. And you can see here the difference between these 3 kings is Jehoshaphat was a God-fearing king, the king of Judah, and he was wanting to inquire of the Lord. He was a God-fearing man. So in verse 13, Elisha said to the king of Israel, "What do we have to do with each other? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." "No," the king of Israel answered, "because it was the Lord who called us 3 kings together to hand us over to Moab." Verse 14, Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look at you or even notice you. But now bring me a harpist." While the harpist was playing, the hand of the Lord came upon Elisha, and he said, "This is what the Lord says. Make this valley full of ditches, for this is what the Lord says. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink." So after they had been marching all this time and they were short on water, Elisha said that they were going to get water just by digging ditches. Verse 18, "This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. He will also hand Moab over to you. You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field with stones." The next morning, about the time for offering the sacrifice, there it was, water flowing from the direction of Edom, and the land was filled with water. So this is a huge miracle as well. All they did was dig ditches, and yet there was water filling those ditches in the morning. Another good story of Elisha is in chapter 4, starting at verse 1. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a little oil." Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." Verse 5, she left him and afterwards shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There's not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." So here we see an absolute provision of God. It's very similar to Elijah with the time when he caused the flour and the oil to continue until the 3 years of drought were over. And here we see a double portion of that anointing. Here we see that this woman took oil and poured it out into so many jars that it could pay all her debts and still leave her money for her and her sons to live on. So it was an even greater miracle than Elijah's. Elijah's, all that did was provide for what they could eat. It didn't go beyond that. But this actually paid off all this woman's debts, besides also giving them provision to live on what was left. So here's a case where we can clearly see the double portion of Elisha. Verse 8, one day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there, who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us. So after this woman had done this for Elisha, we see in verse 14 that Elisha wanted to do something for her. So in verse 14, what can be done for her? Elisha asked. Gehazi, who was his servant, said, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. Then Elisha said, call her. So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. About this time next year, Elisha said, you will hold a son in your arms. No, my lord, she objected. Don't mislead your servant, O man of God. But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about that same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. Verse 18, the child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers. My head, he said to his father. His father told his servants, carry him to his mother. After the servants had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat in her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, then shut the door and went out. She called her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return. Why go to him today? He asked. It's not the new moon or the Sabbath. It's all right, she said. Now, notice that she called her husband after she had shut the door, and she was the only one who knew that her son was dead. And she told her husband it's all right. This woman had faith that God was going to do something. And she actually told her husband it's all right. And she knew that if she went to the man of God, and remember, Elisha was the representative of what God is for us now in the New Testament times. God provides just as well to us in these New Testament times as he did to the people in the times of Elisha through Elisha's ministry. Verse 24, she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, lead on, don't slow for me unless I tell you. So she went out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant, Gehazi, look, there's the Shunammite. Run and meet her and ask her, are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? Everything is all right, she said. Now, isn't that something? She said everything is all right. Her son had died, but she told the prophet everything was all right because she understood something, that God was going to provide. She understood that even though it was a terrible thing that had happened, it was not too big for God to handle it. Verse 27, when she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, leave her alone. She is in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why. So here we see that the woman knew that God was going to provide for her, but she also was overcome with emotion because her son had died. And she was not afraid to show the prophet the fact that she was in bitter distress. Verse 28, did I ask you for a son, my lord? She said. Didn't I tell you don't raise my hopes? So by that statement, Elisha understands that the boy has died. So in verse 32, when Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay upon the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. As he stretched himself out upon him, the boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out upon him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. So here we see the first time that Elisha raised someone from the dead. Now we know that God raised the person from the dead, but it was part of Elisha's ministry. Now remember, God raised a boy from the dead in Elijah's ministry as well. So this is Elisha, and he also raises a boy from the dead. God raises a boy from the dead through Elisha's ministry. But remember, Elisha had a double portion of Elijah's ministry. So if Elijah was going to raise one person from the dead, Elisha was going to raise two. And that happened, sure enough. In 2 Kings chapter 13, in verse 20, Elisha died and was buried. Now, Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders. So they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood on his feet. So here we see a second person raised from the dead through Elisha's ministry, and Elisha was dead himself. So here we see the double portion. Once again, Elisha with double of what Elijah had. Elijah did a lot of good things, but Elisha did double. He had a double portion of that ministry. And here we see that Elisha also had a double portion in another way here. Because here in chapter 13 and verse 20, Elisha died and was buried. He lived his full life until he died. Elijah had a ministry that was about half as long as Elisha's. And Elijah never died. He was caught up to heaven in a whirlwind while he was still able to minister to people. But he had had enough. And so God said, okay, you've had enough. I'll take you. And Elisha will continue the ministry. So really, Elijah had half the ministry that Elisha had. Elisha kept his ministry going until he died. He didn't tell the Lord he'd had enough. He just kept going. Elisha had a double portion of what Elijah had. Now there's one more story about Elisha that has to be told here. And this one is so pertinent that everyone, New Testament and Old, can see and learn from this story about God's protection. And this is just so telling of how we should live our lives as Christians and as followers of God. In 2 Kings chapter 6, starting at verse 8, now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, I will set up my camp in such and such a place. The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, and that man of God was Elisha. Beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there. So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. Verse 11, this enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, will you not tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? In other words, he thinks someone in his own midst is giving away where he's going to be. Verse 12, none of us, my lord the king, said one of the officers, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. Go, find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. The report came back, he is in Dothan. Verse 14, then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. Now remember, this is just Elisha they're after. This is not an army. This is just Elisha that they are coming after with this huge army and with this strong force. So verse 15, when the servant of the man of God got up and went out early in the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh my Lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Verse 16, don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed, O Lord, open his eyes so that he may see. Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now this is such an important story. This tells us about the spiritual realm that is invisible to us, but it is just as real as the physical realm. You notice that Elisha saw into this spiritual realm. Elisha, he already knew that these chariots were there. And he actually prayed to God to open his servant's eyes so he could see that there was armies of angels surrounding him. There was horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And Elisha wasn't the least bit worried. He didn't care if there was a whole army around him, surrounding him. It didn't even matter. Elisha knew that a whole army was no match for God. He had the protection of God around him. You remember in Psalm 91 where it says he'll give his angels charge over you to guard you in all your ways. And Elisha had a revelation of that. And he saw in the spiritual realm that he was surrounded by the angels of God, that there was protection around him. And no army was going to get at this one man, Elisha. He stood alone, and knew he wasn't alone. He knew he had the armies of God at his back. Verse 18, as the army came down towards him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, strike these people with blindness. So he struck them with blindness, as Elisha had asked. Elisha told them, this is not the road, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for. And he led them to Samaria. Now, Samaria is where the king of Israel was. Verse 20, after they entered the city, Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see. Then the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. Now, Elisha had led this army, this force of people, right to the heart of Samaria, right to the heart of Israel, and right to the king. Verse 21, when the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them? Verse 22, do not kill them, Elisha answered. Would you kill men you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them, so that they may eat and drink, and then go back to their master. So he prepared a great feast for them, and after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. This is almost laughable how easy it was for Israel to overcome this threat. These bands of raiders from Aram had been raiding Israel's territory, and they went after Elisha, the prophet, the man of God. Big mistake, big mistake. Elisha, just like God, no problem. He doesn't even use the chariots around him. He has chariots of angels around him. He has protection around him. He could have said, okay, well, just wipe out this band of people. You notice Elisha didn't do that. Elisha had a double portion of Elijah's spirit. He wasn't calling for the blood of these people. He was looking for these people to stop attacking Israel, because that was the goal. The goal was to have the people stop attacking Israel. So Elisha, he had him struck with blindness for a temporary period of time, and then leads them right to the king of Israel. And when they're right before the king of Israel, he takes away their blindness, and there they are, in the hands of their enemies. And Elisha was merciful. Elisha said, don't kill these men. Give them a feast. And he gave the enemies a big feast. And then he sent them right back to Aram. And so, of course, from then on, Aram understood that they were not going to get away with attacking Israel. So, mission accomplished. Check. No more attacks from the king of Aram. So this is a great example for us. First of all, it's an example of how we have the armies of God. The angels of the Lord are encamped around about us. We have the protection of God. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean anything. You always have an angel or angels around you. You're always in God's protection if you'll just take advantage of it. And notice that Elisha didn't even take advantage of that. What he did is he prayed to God and said, okay, blind these people's eyes. Let's just save their lives and we'll just stop the attacks. In other words, Elisha, he didn't even use the protection that he had. He went beyond that and said, we're going to stop these attacks and we're going to accomplish our mission and we're going to bless these people. Elisha actually blessed these enemies of God who were out to destroy Israel. He actually blessed them and sent them back and also stopped the attacks. So the people could see the nature of God. Elisha had a revelation of the fact that God's nature was to love people and protect people. God was protecting Israel, and he was protecting Elisha. And Elisha was so used to the protection of God, and he understood so well that that protection was there, that he knew he didn't even have to use it. He could go above and beyond and actually bless people and still accomplish what needed to be done. So this is a story that I believe every Christian should read and study and remember. Just simply remember there are the angels of the Lord encamped around about you. If you lay claim to the promise of God in Psalm 91 that he gives his angels charge over you to guard you in all your ways, guess what? He's got the angels of the Lord guarding you in all your ways. And notice that he guards you in all your ways. You're not going to get everything right, in other words. You're going to screw up sometimes. And that's why you need the angels of the Lord around you. You need protection because you're not going to always get everything right. If you did everything right the first time and you just listened to God and obeyed him, you wouldn't even need the protection of God. Elisha, he didn't even need that protection that was around him. He was more than able to handle this army by himself without the protection of the Lord around him. But he still wanted his servant to understand the protection that was around him. He wanted the servant to understand that God protects. Love always protects. Remember 1 John 4:8, God is love. And then 1 Corinthians 13, we read what love is. Love always protects. Always protects. That word love is agape. And agape always protects. Love always protects. So God always protects. We just have to stay under that umbrella of his protection because he's always protecting. And Elisha had a good revelation of that. And we need to learn from Elisha's example here. So that's my message on the double portion of Elisha. Thanks for watching.